Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for listening. We've been off for a couple of weeks, but we are back, and it is good to be back because there is so much that we need to talk about, so much that I have not had a chance to really dig into, but we're going to do it today. And so if you remember the last episode, we talked about environmental apartheid. We talked about the reality that in our world, here in the United States, all around the world, we have an environmental apartheid system. We have a reality where certain groups are given certain environmental protections, certain opportunities to protect themselves from the impacts of things like climate change and different natural disasters and different ways that the environment impacts a community, and some people just aren't. They're ignored, they're neglected, they're left to fend for themselves. And what we talked about in that episode was the reality that that is not by circumstance. It is not a coincidence. The truth is we have a system, a two-tiered system that privileges one group over another. And this system is upheld with laws, upheld with policies, upheld with all types of mechanisms to ensure that the ones who are in the upper class, the ones who are in the majority, who have the power, have the ability to live in a certain way, live in a certain environment that's protected, that's safe, that's clean, while the rest are not. And we made the point that it's not simply just a coincidence. It's not simply just unintended consequences or unintended impacts or unintended ways of operating. These things are intentional. These things are deliberate and directed. And so in that episode, we talked about environmental apartheid, and I made the case that we can look at it in terms of three elements of environmental apartheid. I said that we could look at climate apartheid, we could look at infrastructure apartheid, we can look at food apartheid. All these different elements, in my view, make up what we are describing as environmental apartheid in a society, in a nation around the world. And so on this episode, I want to spend some time talking about the first one, climate apartheid, because this phrase is getting a lot of traction. People are talking more and more about it, and people are beginning to understand what it looks like when people are actually trying to deal with the impacts of climate change. And we can see that those ways of dealing with climate change are very disproportionate, very different depending on where you're from, what community you're a part of, and what the people who are in power choose to do as it relates to the communities and the infrastructure and the cities and the amenities that are in those areas. And so we need to talk about climate apartheid, and we're going to do that on this episode. Now, just to get us all on the same page, the actual phrase climate apartheid was coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. If you don't know Desmond Tutu, he was a major player, a major figure, a titan of civil rights in South Africa during the apartheid era. And he was credited with many others as helping to bring down the apartheid regime and the apartheid systems in South Africa. And so in a 2007 report written by the United Nations, in that report, he coins this phrase, climate apartheid. He looks at what apartheid looked like in South Africa, and he looks at how climate change and the impacts from climate change are being dealt with around the world. And he believes, and I agree, that we have an apartheid system as it relates to climate change. He said in his report that, I'm going to read it straight from the report. He said that climate adaptation is becoming a euphemism for social injustice on a global scale. So his argument is, when we're talking about adapting to the impacts of climate change, trying to deal with the fallout from climate change, you're creating social injustice as you seek to adapt to climate change. And his point was that the actual ways in which people choose to deal with climate change, how they choose to deal with its impact on, for instance, the way communities are built, the way systems are structured, the ways in which people are given resources to deal with the impacts, to deal with the fallout, is creating an unjust, unequal society. And so what he wanted to do with the idea of climate apartheid was to try to make sure that we're paying attention, not just to the environmental impacts, not just to the climate change impacts, but to the ways in which people who have resources are dealing with those as compared to those who don't have the resources. You know, in his view, you can't just say, well, things are just different. People are being treated differently. And so we just need to ensure that things aren't done differently. His point is, we have very deliberate approaches and very deliberate decisions being made that privilege some over others. And in his view, here's what he says. He says that in practice, adaptation has resulted in the form of apartheid, in which the citizens of the rich world are protected from harm, while the poor, the vulnerable, and the hungry are exposed to the harsh reality of climate change in their everyday lives. So just think about that for 1 second. And we can see this now with these heat waves coming, right? We know that certain people have the ability to shield themselves from the heat. You have nice, large, air-conditioned homes. You have access to clean water, access to things like pools and other social infrastructure that keeps you from the heat. You might live in a neighborhood that has more trees, more cover, more green space that allows you to not be as hot as some other communities who might not have those amenities. You don't have the parks. You don't have the public facilities to go into. You don't have a home with central air conditioning. You don't have a situation where you can just go and sit under a tree, go to the pool, and cool off and relax. You might be living in a densely populated urban area with lots of buildings, lots of pavements and roads and traffic. And it makes that hot area even hotter. And his point would be that that's intentional. That's not just a coincidence. That people who have the resources are creating spaces where they can protect themselves from climate change impacts and shield themselves from what could happen, while not allowing those who are more vulnerable, who are less resourced, who are poor, and in this case, who are communities of color, receive those same resources and have that same opportunity. You just don't have it. And that system is the climate apartheid system. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're referring to. You know, I read this article. It's a really good article. It was written in the Critical Philosophy of Race journal. The article is entitled Climate Apartheid, the Forgetting of Race in the Anthropocene. Very technical article, very specific, deliberate discussion of this phrase called a climate apartheid, but it was very instructive. For instance, here's what some of the article says about apartheid and climate apartheid in particular. It says apartheid involves deeply held systematic beliefs and dispositions regarding racial superiority that not only impact individual beliefs and practices, but were infused into and supported by various social institutions like education, labor, and policing. And so that's the idea of apartheid. And so they go a little bit further and they say to appreciate the nature of climate apartheid would require attention to the more subtle, normalized, and often muted ways in which systematic institutional racism circulates in societies, as well as the ways in which it is impacted by other forms of systematic oppression, such as gender, class, race. And so this article just lays out the framework for how to think about and how to understand this whole idea of climate apartheid and the way in which it is infused with the way society operates. Because nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens independently. All of these things go together. And so when we talk about the idea of climate change being a big existential threat and a big problem that needs to be confronted, what ends up happening is that our attempts to confront it are infused with the way our society operates and the way in which it views its citizens. It's just the way that our society functions. It's unfortunate because I don't like racism. I don't like sexism. But because it exists in our society, you see it in the way in which climate change and its impacts are being engaged and confronted. And that's the problem. That's the problem when you look at different communities and you can see the difference. You can see the vulnerability of certain communities of color. You can see how they're exposed to natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, how much more frequently it occurs in those communities than in others. You can see how much hotter it is in those areas than others. These are not coincidences. It is not just a matter of chance that this is the case. It is a reflection of the climate apartheid that is present all across the world. And so this article, I'm not going to go into it on the podcast. You can read the article. I put it in the description. But they highlight 3 instances where they see climate apartheid happening in real time. The first is in the climate adaptation policies in Nigeria. They look at race and coal mining in the United States after the Civil War, so after slavery was abolished. And they look at rainforest destruction in Brazil. And so I would encourage everybody when they read this article, look at those examples and read through how the author sees the ways in which climate apartheid exists in those particular instances, because it's really informative. It is really illuminating. And it's something that we don't talk enough about when we talk about climate change. We don't talk enough about how the ways in which things are done, the ways in which we choose to mitigate or adapt or to adjust to what the change in climate requires, how that's being done in an unequal, discriminatory fashion. It's just the reality. And that whole idea is summed up in this word, climate apartheid. Climate apartheid is something that you have to make sure you are fully aware of when you talk about dealing with climate change. Don't fall for the kind of globalizing of an approach. You know, we all have to think about different ways to adapt. No, we don't. Because wherever you live, your vulnerability, your resources, your capacities are going to be different. And it's going to require that whoever's making decisions takes that into account when policies, when practices are put into place. We have to make sure that happens. The whole point of this article, the whole point of this podcast episode is simply this. If we're talking about climate change and dealing with its impacts, we have to talk about climate apartheid and ultimately climate justice. And so when we think about climate justice, that ultimately depends on having responsible mitigation strategies that actually address climate change. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to change the way we produce energy. We need to change the way we deal with waste and all the contributors to climate change to try and reduce the rate, the severity, the impact of our changing environment. That's what justice looks like. You're actually trying to reduce all of the impacts on everyone directly. Now, of course, that takes a lot of time. And so in the meantime, we can't wait. We need to adapt and adjust and protect ourselves as we do that. And unfortunately, us adapting will lead inevitably to differences in how local governments, state governments, national governments implement policies to adapt, how we recover from disasters, how we plan our cities and our water systems and our stormwater systems and our energy networks. All that comes into play when we talk about how we can insulate ourselves from the impact of climate change. And that happens unequally. And so when we even talk about the adaptation, when we think about what the Archbishop Tutu had to say about it, he had some very specific concerns. And I have to say, I share his concerns, right? So one thing he's concerned about is, what are we willing to adapt to, right? So what kind of change in the climate are we willing to actually make concessions for and change the way we operate to adapt to? Some things are unavoidable, right? If it's flooding, you have to adapt to that. If it's extremely hot, you have to adapt to it because you can't live underwater and you can't live in extreme heat. You have to adapt. But what about the other things? What about air pollution? What about water quality? Because those things happen disproportionately in certain communities. Are we willing to actually put in resources to adapt to those? When you live in a community where there's tons of industry, coal-fired power plants, large manufacturing facilities that pollute, that harm the environment in those areas, are we willing to make those adaptations to protect those communities from those industries as we work toward cleaning things up? I don't know. It's a good question. And depending on who lives in those areas, quite often determines the degree to which adaptation measures are put in place in those communities. Dr. Robert Bullard had this book. He's known worldwide as the father of environmental justice. He has a book. It's called The Wrong Complexion for Protection. You should read the book because in the book, he talks about the fact that Black communities in the United States, because they are Black communities in the United States, don't get the protection that they need when disaster comes, when climate change impacts directly impact their way of life. And he would argue, you got the wrong complexion. Someone else could have gotten that protection, but you won't because of how you look. And it builds on the idea that race is the determining factor for experiencing environmental injustice, experiencing environmental inequity, and it is the primary driver for why things are the way they are. Not income, not class, not education. It's race. And so what are we going to adapt to? Another concern Mr. Tutu had was who and what gets protected. We talked about the who, the different people, and that's fine. But what gets protected? What infrastructure? What monuments? What facilities? What cities? What areas of a city get the protection? I know I'm here in South Carolina in the United States, and we're big on tourism. So all the tourist attractions, all the tourist cities and those tourist places get the money because the idea is that's what's bringing in income and revenue into the state. It needs to be protected at all costs. And so we have to corral our resources to ensure nothing happens to those particular areas. But what about everybody else? What about the people who don't have the resources to protect themselves? How are we adapting to ensure that they don't fall victim to some of these climate change impacts? That's the question. That's the question. And so we have to think about who and what gets protected as we put forth this idea of adapting to climate change. We can't get rid of it We're trying to do things differently. We're advocating for different policies. We're trying to reduce gas emissions. We're trying to protect people and protect places. But who gets that protection? Who gets the protection? What gets the protection? These are important questions. And as we think about this whole idea of climate apartheid, we have to recognize that who gets the protection and what gets the protection is not a function of just simple, indiscriminate distribution of resources. Who gets the protection, what gets the protection is a direct result of decisions that are made by decision makers who have decided that certain people deserve it, certain places deserve it, and certain people don't, and certain places don't. And they put value on those places when they make those decisions. And unfortunately, in our society, we are awash with racism, awash with classism, awash with sexism. And so those views are influencing and impacting the way those decisions are made. There's just no way around it. There's no way around it. And so that is exactly what the concern is when it comes to climate apartheid. And we already know that it's a problem. People are sounding the alarm right now. I read an article, I'll put an article in the description as well. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He says that we have a climate apartheid scenario where the wealthy pay to escape overheating, to escape hunger, and to escape conflicts while the rest of the world suffers. That's what he's saying. He's trying to tell us that this whole idea of climate apartheid is not simply just a matter of having clean water, having clean air, and ensuring that we can manage with the heat that's coming. He believes, and I would agree with him, that climate change and the way that we deal with the impacts from it have strong implications for human rights and leave the door open for human rights abuses because of how we choose to deal with climate change. And so what he says is, while we all know that climate change impacts food, it impacts your quality of life, and impacts your housing, he argues that it's going to be a huge impact to democracy and a huge impact to the social fabric of a community. Because what he says is that as climate change becomes more and more of an issue, and as more and more resources are being sent to deal with it, governments are going to have to make decisions. And they're going to have to try to persuade the people who they're governing to accept certain changes and certain transformations in their social lives, economically, politically, to try and deal with the fallout from climate change. And so to do that means that you're going to tell certain people that certain things are going to be changing because of climate change. And who are those people? And how's it going to change? And what influence, what input will these communities have when those changes are being proposed, when they're being put forth by these governments, by these agencies? And so he says in this setting, civil rights and political rights will be very vulnerable, especially when you have a situation where you have, like we do in the United States, lots of corporate money, lots of corporate lobbying, lots of, we call it dark money, where you don't know where the money's coming from, but it's being sent to different politicians, different campaigns to try and influence their decision making and influence their policies. Now you're taking climate change, which we know is a problem. You're taking this money that's meant to deal with it, which is being sent and being, in theory, distributed to address it. And now you have powerful groups, powerful corporations, powerful people dictating exactly how that money is spent and exactly who will benefit from the adaptation that we're trying to implement in our communities, in our cities and states. And it's going to be a big problem. It's going to be a very big problem because the people who actually need the help, who need the resources, won't have the voice, won't have the financial ability to influence and impact the discussion the way that some of these corporations will, the way that some of these large groups will. And so now, if that is the reality, if that's what happens moving forward, then how are we going to avoid the erosion of some of the rights and some of the things that we hold dear when it's being told to us that they have to be jettisoned in order to deal with this climate change reality? That's not going to be a good look for anybody. And as we continue to think through it and continue to imagine the future, we can't do that and still operate with this whole climate apartheid system, this whole idea that we can kind of financially insulate ourselves from these impacts and we can find ways around dealing with them directly, which we would call it adaptation. We can't do that. And so this is part one, climate apartheid. We're talking about environmental apartheid as a whole. This is one element of it, climate apartheid. There's others that will be coming in the coming weeks and months, but I just want to make sure that climate apartheid is on your radar, that you're aware of this term, aware of this concern, and that you understand the far-reaching implications of climate apartheid, because it's not simply just a matter of people being treated differently. It is fundamentally a two-tiered system of dealing with climate change, of dealing with the impacts. And we want to make sure that as we talk about how critical it is to deal with climate change, how important it is to reduce our emissions, how important it is to do things differently, that we're not doing so in a way that allows for the wealthy, majority, politically connected ones to decide for everyone else what that looks like. We need to ensure that this system of apartheid is dismantled and that people from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, have an equal say and equal input into the ways in which we deal with climate change all around us. Because without that, we lose more than just our environmental quality. We lose our social quality, our political quality, and ultimately our civil quality, civil rights. Those things go away as well. And so we cannot be idle when it comes to thinking about this issue. So I hope that now you are at least a little more aware of the reality that climate apartheid is and will be something that we need to directly confront to ensure that as we move forward, we do so in an equitable way, that we have climate change policies, climate action that benefits all of us and not just some of us. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast, where we are for the people and for the planet. I will see you next time.